Hey all, it's been a minute. It's been one of the things that I've been working on where I've kind of been doing more hell mode on the new Artillerist, kind of testing a couple builds, and I think I finally landed on a build that I prefer using. So this is going to be kind of going over the choices I've made on stats, runes, skills, some tips as well at the end of it about how to play, especially in Helvicus. It can be kind of an issue playing some of the Barrage Artillerist variants. So I wanted to kind of start with the Artillerist video just because this is kind of what I've been playing more of in the Deathless kind of stuff that I'm doing. And then I'll make an Arcana video later with the build that I've kind of settled on for that as well. So there are a lot of new, with the patch, a lot of new Artillerist and Arcana players, so I kind of wanted to give you guys a starting point for what I've tested and what I've found works for me. So overall, the thing kind of with both these classes, when I do Helvicus specifically, is I've wanted more kind of redundancy in the rotation. So the boss specifically in like gate 2 and a little bit in gate 3 can actually dodge a lot of your stuff. And with the way current Artillerist works now, like if you miss a flamethrower or a gravity explosion or something on the boss, um, you're kind of screwed for a pretty long time. So that's why I've kind of ended with the double filler build, so the enhanced shell and the forward barrage. It does give you a little bit more of that redundancy. So the goal, obviously, being to rotate in and out of turret as much as possible and get as many rotations as you can on the boss. One thing that I've kind of noticed is people not really expecting how sweaty that this class can be in hell mode. Um, you have to kind of coordinate with your support a lot and really think about when you're going into turret and make some decisions that will either increase your DPS by a lot or lose a ton of uptime. So um, if you're trying to put up some ridiculous numbers and have really good pulls sometimes, Barrage is definitely where you want to be playing. But if you're trying to like not sweat and just play a class where I don't have to worry about it that much, FP is definitely viable as well. The ceiling obviously on that build is not as high, but it's definitely workable. So starting with stats, I kind of set up my character settings already with what I normally run in these hell mode runs. Um, sorry, I'm still a little sick. I usually go 1700 spec, 500 crit. However, if you're less familiar with the fight, you can take out some crit for swiftness, or if you have some crit synergies. Obviously, you're not going to overcap with the way Artillerist works now and how they've moved crit around. So I like having as many points as possible in crit, even if I don't have a movement skill in this kind of build right now. But if you're learning the fight, there's definitely nothing wrong with going like even up to 400 swiftness would still be fine. Um, so looking at skills, uh, so obviously like stuff like homing barrage is not going to change, right? Air raid's not going to change. This is all the same. Um, I prefer using laser turret. The reason being for that is I was trying to use big pack, but I would notice that I wouldn't really have time in between my rotation to kind of put down 3 turrets. And thinking about it more, it kind of just made more sense that I'd want the same amount or more damage over 2 casts instead of 3, right? So why would I waste the time to put down a third turret when I could just put down a second one that does more damage, right? It just saves me extra time as well. Plus the usability. Sometimes if I spend time putting down 3 turrets and the boss moves, it's kind of a waste of time and pretty terrible for your DPS as well. So the idea here is just to have a leaner rotation and have better damage per skill cast essentially. I have tried the pressurized heat bomb ability, and I've tried both the dash variants and the holding variants. To be honest, they're both viable, but I felt like the rotation wasn't very smooth when I was using them. So I felt like I was waiting a little too long because, especially when you use this first tripod, which gives it the most amount of damage, the cooldown of it goes up pretty significantly, and it wasn't really lining up with the turret rotations that I wanted to do. So I ended up switching off it, but you could definitely use it if you wanted to. You could also use swing instead of forward barrage. In fact, when I was first doing Helvicus with these builds, I was using swing, and I would definitely recommend it if you're still getting used to the fight. You could take 10 points in enhanced shell and then take 7 points in swing. Give yourself an extra mobility skill. But as you get more familiar with how the fight works and you know that you can get to where you need to be with swiftness robes or whatever, I would definitely remove swing because the double filler skill does actually help a lot when you're trying to rotate in and out. So yeah, looking at rune setup. So quick kind of update with what I'm playing. I'm using a setup that uses a lot of wealth runes, partially because the way Artillerist kind of pays you off is going in and out as soon as possible. I make a couple different choices than some of the builds I've seen. I prefer putting bleed on summon turret just because having better uptime. This is kind of going to give you your best uptime, and putting your eggs in the basket of wealth working on these turrets can sometimes really backfire on you because the boss can easily move out of these turret ranges, and if you're planning on having these turrets be one of your main generators for meter, you can kind of get screwed. So kind of the way I look at turrets is it's a way to keep up firepower and a way to do pretty decent damage without having to worry about them and also apply bleed stack. So that's kind of the role that turrets have for me in this build. Wealth on air raid because it has more generation than homing barrage. The flamethrower is going to be your best gauge builder, obviously, and then your gravity explosion and forward barrage are going to be your two best ones after that. So that's kind of where I've aligned the wealth runes. You could put Purify here if you're playing a gate that needs it. This is kind of your flex rune on Enhanced Shell. However, I put Rage here. I've kind of moved off of using Rage on Howitzer, so most guides you'll see put Rage on this ability. The thing I've kind of noticed is I might not always open with Q when I go into turret, and that's kind of like a Vicus and probably Hell Clown specific thing. As bosses get more and more mobile and the windows get smaller and smaller, kind of opening with Q sometimes doesn't make that much sense because you'll miss out on most of your E or even like parts of your W. So yeah, that's kind of the reasoning why I've moved Rage here. One, it kind of makes the builder rotation slightly faster. So if I proc Rage and I use Flamethrower or use Gravity Explosion, that's faster. And also because before I enter turret, I typically like to throw the Enhanced Shell anyway to get the synergy out, just in case I don't use Q. So it could proc the Rage before you go into turret either way. So that's kind of where I'm headed on that. I prefer Galewind on Focus Fire. Reason being, kind of similar. A lot of people don't know that you get an extra damage multiplier for staggered bosses. So I prefer to put it on this ability because I want to make the most of that additional damage multiplier. So by being able to squeeze this ability into that window a little bit faster, it could potentially give you some damage where you wouldn't get it before. So that's really the only reason why I've gone gold here and purple here. But yeah. Yeah, that's kind of the main stuff about runes. There's a little bit of flexibility, obviously, and you can mess around with it as you're on your own, but that's kind of where I've landed. So looking at engravings, kind of the stuff that's set in stone for me is Barrage, All Out Attack, Grudge, and Keen Blunt Weapon. And then this last one can be Adrenaline or Curse Stall if you have a lot of crit synergy and you don't want to deal with Adrenaline, or Ether Predator if you're going for Deathless potentially. I really like All Out Attack on, especially in Vicus, because it kind of guarantees some of the damage and some of your builders landing, where if you don't have it, if you had like a Hitmaster in this scenario, the spreadsheet DPS on Hitmaster is technically higher, but you will miss out on more damage realistically because maybe you might not hit a full laser or you might not hit a full turret W because it's a little slower because you're not running All Out Attack. So this to me is kind of what I've landed on and what I'm playing for pretty much every pull in Deathless and clears. For the set, there's not really a whole lot to discuss. Obviously, you're going to go Salvation. And then taking a look at kind of our gems here, I think these are pretty set too, as I've played with it more and more. I don't know if this is even going to help. So really the only change here is I've added... So I use both the summon turret cooldown and damage gems. I think that there's no... So with double filler build specifically, I don't think you need a cooldown gem on either forward barrage or enhanced shell because the way that the rotation works kind of works the same even if you do have them or versus don't have them. So it doesn't really change anything. So standard, both nukes with both cooldown and damage. But now we have to add the flamethrower cooldown just because the increase to the cooldown, so they kind of nerfed the cooldown on this a little bit. So the increase to the cooldown kind of facilitates you wanting to have one so you can fit it in the one in every turret window, right? Other than that, kind of the standard energy field, cooldown, gravity explosion for damage and cooldown. Obviously, this is like one of the main skills that have changed that is really good for both generation and damage. So you want a little bit of, you want both of that on there. Homing barrage, obviously, and then the barrage skill damage. I've noticed some people using barrage skill cooldown, but I think it's kind of a bait. The idea here being that you can Q, then W, then Q, then E, then Q. However, a lot of times that's not really realistic, and there's kind of like an awkward pause in between when you're using the abilities. So I really don't like using it. I'd rather just take like a summon turret cooldown gem in that place right there. So anyway, that's kind of the overall of the build. I'll go over some like rotation tips and stuff that I've seen, and stuff that I've noticed as I've played that has helped me out a little bit. The first thing is looking at the first rotation. This is kind of where you're coming in. You don't have any firepower gauge, and you don't have any barrage gauge. Typically, I'll try to put down my 2 turrets because usually the boss is like invulnerable or something like that, right? And I'm coming in and I throw in my 2 turrets. Also, it kind of helps with the gauge on its own. But typically, the way I'm doing it is I'm using both my fillers. I'll typically use flamethrower because it does the least amount of damage. Both nukes. I'll use more fillers, and then this will usually top it off. And then if I have this up, I'll use it, and then I'll just kind of go into it. So the second rotation, I'm just going to go through this, is a little bit more, it can be a little bit more freeform, because you should be at max firepower anyway. So I normally open with the fillers, and I kind of just take a look at my cooldowns, right? Like whatever makes the most sense. So in this scenario, I'm probably going to put these down just because I haven't had a chance to. And then I'm just going to do this, right? So really, there's no huge set rotation here. It's kind of just based on cooldown availability and kind of weaving in your fillers as much as possible to give yourself that that gauge as you come out, right? So I'm just like taking a look at my cooldown bar, kind of deciding what makes sense based on what's up, and putting my fillers in between every time I can, right? And the idea is just to get generate this gauge as fast as possible. So some notes. One specific thing that I see a lot of artillerists kind of doing wrong as they play hell mode specifically is the way they do turret decision making. So kind of the thing that I see a lot of players do is they'll just do the same thing every time, or they'll just try to do Q, W, E, Q every time, right? However, in hell mode, that's not necessarily it's not necessarily going to work out that way. One, because the boss wants to move a lot, right? And 2, because you want to fit all the important skills in that window. So when I'm looking at like, hey, what should I open with in the turret? I don't really open with Q that often. The reason being is because even though it does apply synergy, it kind of takes a while to get going, and it takes a lot of time out of like that opening for you to fit these other skills in. So typically what I'll end up doing is I'll usually open with E or W, and it'll depend on what's going on. So with E, obviously there's a range factor, right? It has way more range than the W. It can reach like pretty far distances. With W, the benefit is that it has a little bit more mobility on it, right? So if the boss is, if I'm not really sure like what the boss is going to do next, I'll typically open with W just because it makes it easier to follow, right? Also, you want to open with W on staggers or open with W on potentially counters, right? So where I'll open with E is if it's out of range of W, obviously, or if I know that the boss is going to allow me to land an entire E without moving. Like I know it's a pretty stationary pattern, right? So typically I'll open with either E or W, and then I'll Q in the middle. And so what that'll look like is I'll go into turret, I'll unload my W, I'll kind of take a look at what the pattern's doing, I'll Q in the middle, and I'll do E. And this is kind of like a good middle ground in between Q, W, E, Q, because it kind of allows me to guarantee that I'm going to hit the entire turret W or entire turret E, and kind of not give up on a lot of that damage. Because a lot of times what I'll see is people will try to Q, but the boss will move away before they're able to get any W or E damage off, and that's like a pretty big DPS loss versus just opening with W or E and then proceeding from there. One thing that's also kind of interesting is if I W and I start my E or whatever, right, and I notice that the boss is gonna move, I can cancel and then Q and then E again. Whereas if I don't have this Q up, right, say I Q'd and I start an E and I have to cancel it for some reason and get this cooldown back, there's like kind of a time where I have to wait until I can do it again. Whereas if I show this again, if I cancel, it'll let me Q immediately while I wait for this E to come back up, and then I can go in again. So that's kind of just like an interesting interaction that can sometimes happen. Really, it's just like gauging how much time I have before the boss might potentially move away, and making like a risk management decision. Like, am I willing to give up potentially missing an entire W and E to get this Q first? Sometimes on like a boss stagger, you know it's going to be there for a while, then I can get all 4 turret skills in, all 4 being Q, W, E, Q. But if the boss is still moving around, it's nowhere near stagger or anything like that, typically I'll just open with Q, or sorry, open with W and then Q in the middle, then E. Cool. Another thing I'm kind of noticing is people leaving their turret unnecessarily. So one thing about that is kind of knowing boss patterns, how much damage it's going to do, right? How, the hitboxes of them, asking for support damage reduction cooldowns. So typically their support damage reduction cooldowns are going to be about 10 seconds. So you can kind of keep track of that as well. And asking for that stuff so you don't have to abandon a turret is pretty important to the playstyle of how this class is supposed to work. So definitely keep that in mind. And as you watch yourself play, kind of note how many turrets you're losing because you're not asking for, because you didn't know the boss pattern, or you're not asking for DR at the right time. Another thing I've kind of noticed is people holding their turrets for too long. So what I'll see a lot of times is this kind of scenario where you have a full gauge, right? But you know the boss is about to go into a pattern. So here I usually just rip it, even if I know the boss is going to go into a pattern. If I can get a full W off, it's fine. The reason being is because when this boss comes back from this pattern, typically you're not going to have firepower meters, so you're going to have to restack it anyway, right? So like, if I tried the turret here and don't have any firepower gauge, it does like no damage anyway, right? I'd rather guarantee the full, because there's a pretty big difference in this versus the W damage when the gauge is full, right? So you'll notice it does like almost twice as much damage because of the scaling on it. So to me, to some extent, I'm kind of just like, I'd rather get the damage that I can get because I'm going to have to rebuild gauge anyway. Like, I'm going to have to rebuild firepower gauge anyway. So I might as well get the damage that I can get. So I will typically pretty much always default to using turret more rather than less, because you end up just doing more damage that way, to be honest. One thing to note as well, when you say you're in the scenario where you have full barrage gauge, you didn't get a chance to use it before an important boss pattern, it's pretty important to know, okay, what's the most efficient way to refill this firepower gauge so I can dump this barrage mode? So realistically, the most efficient way would be to use gravity explosion, but the cooldown on this is pretty long, so I typically don't actually like using this. So what I'll typically do is I'll just use both nukes and use a flamethrower. And what you'll notice is when I like cycle through my turret rotation, and I'll just kind of go through it. I'm only going to use one Q just to keep it a little bit more realistic, so I'll just use the one at the beginning. So I cycle through my turret rotation. You'll notice that by the time I'm going to need this flamethrower, it's going to be up again. Whereas gravity explosion is not necessarily going to be up if you do a rotation like this. So that's typically what I'll do, is just, if I need to build gauge quickly, it's just both nukes and flamethrower. Just quick, efficient, and it'll get you the gauge you need so you can start cycling barrage again. Another thing that's kind of important for this class now is identifying when your holding skills are going to miss. So obviously if you miss either this flamethrower or this, because this flamethrower gives you a ton of gauge and this gravity explosion gives you a ton of gauge, right? So if you're going to miss either of them, it's pretty important to identify that early so that you can stop casting the spell and you can refund the cooldown, right? It works with both of these abilities. However, if you hold it slightly too long, you'll notice that it'll eat the cooldown anyway. So just one thing to keep in mind, if you do try to cancel this, make sure you're doing it early enough so you don't get screwed on specifically that cooldown reset, right? So one thing I'm kind of noticing as well is kind of turret awakening usage. So one thing you kind of want to do is you want to put it down right before you go into turret, and then as you cycle, you want to cast the second part of it kind of right before you leave, right? So by casting it here, now I can just like do 2 abilities and I'm already back in turret. So the whole point of this is it's no longer like a burst ability, it's kind of just like a gauge filler. So some things to note about this is that sometimes if you wait too long, you actually lose the second recast of it, right? So I think it's normally, I don't want to give you the wrong information. I think it's normally like 7, maybe 8 seconds before you can't actually recast this again. So you want to keep that in mind because right now I just lost my ability to recast it, right? So if you do lose the ability to recast, you're actually losing a pretty significant amount because the recast itself will get you like 90% of the way to getting back into identity gauge, right? So yeah. Some other things that I've kind of gotten used to as well is summon turrets. Like as you go into things like Swamp and Vicus Gate 3, you kind of want to put it down like before you go do the mechanic. One, because it'll keep applying bleed, and two, because it'll keep your firepower meter maxed. So you actually lose quite a significant amount of damage if you let your firepower meter lapse over and over because you got to rebuild it, and you're not getting any scaling on any of the abilities that you're using to restack that gauge. So another thing is if you're using a build like this where it's double filler, you have to make sure that you're pretty I don't know, you don't care about using a ton of swiftness robes essentially, right? So I will literally hit a swiftness robe if there's like anything kind of suspect about my positioning and I need to get anywhere fast, especially on these no swift, like no mobility class, no mobility skill classes. You have to get used to using swiftness robe in order to get yourself out of these situations. So yeah, that's kind of the quick overview of what I've learned as I've done all these polls on Vicus and as I've come up with the class. My thoughts on Barrage Artillerist is that it's kind of a class that you have to try pretty hard to get pretty good. You have to try hard and you have to greed pretty hard to get good performance out of it. But it does have probably one of the highest ceilings of any class in this type of content if you're willing to put in the time and the effort. And the new Barrage Artillerist, as weird as it is to say, it kind of has a similar ceiling to what it had before. It's just a lot easier to play because now you're no longer doing like the weird double nuke windows. Now you're kind of just focused on kind of being a transformation class, trying to get in and out of turret as much as possible. And ultimately the damage you do is going to be entirely reliant on, hey, how many turrets did I lose over this fight? So when you're kind of looking back and studying your gameplay, that's kind of the frame I would look at it through is like, okay, did I miss a turret rotation anywhere in this fight, right? Could I have picked better times to go into turrets? Did I do the right decisions when I entered turret in order to maximize the value I'm getting out of every turret? Things like that is kind of how you should be looking at the gameplay of this class going forward. So yeah. Anyway, if you guys have any questions, obviously this is kind of my personal thoughts and the build that I've had the most success on in Hell Vicus specifically. Hell Valton, I've done pretty well with this build as well. So if you have any questions specific to the fight or anything like that, or different rune choices, different ability choices, definitely let me know in the comments and I'd be more than willing to answer. So cool. Thank you all for watching.